Welcome to the first session of this course, Biography of a City, Lawrence. My name is Dennis Domer, and I'm the coordinator and person chiefly responsible for this course. And I look forward to getting to know each of you better during the semester. The Biography of a City, Lawrence is an extension of a series of previous courses on St. Petersburg, New York, Rome, Los Angeles, and other cities that have been offered for a number of years at the University of Kansas. Lawrence is obviously quite different from these gigantic cities that represent centers of the world's culture. And perhaps I need to give some explanation for adding Lawrence to this distinguished list of cities that other faculty have addressed in the past. When I was an undergraduate 30 years ago, I would not have considered this town worthy of study. It's true that one of my heroes today, James Malin, was a faculty member in the KU History Department who taught regional history and wrote profusely on Kansas and the Great Plains. However, I never would have taken a course from him, I'm quite sure. After all, I grew up in Kansas, had come to Lawrence for band days, football games, and track meets. Lawrence was really just another small town in Kansas that just happened to have the big university. I knew all I wanted to know about Kansas at that time. I was a French major at Baker, and I wanted to know about Paris, Marseille, New York, anywhere far away from Kansas that was exciting, cultured, and sophisticated. Those were also the places our faculty wanted to discuss, not anything regional, not even Kansas City. Perhaps this has all changed in part because these faraway places are so accessible to us now. There is so much more information, so easy to get, and it is so easy to travel. The New York Times comes to my office daily. I can email my friends in Europe instantaneously. CNN is at our fingertips. Phones are relatively cheap. And in many different ways, we can bring the world into our homes effortlessly. It may also be that we've traveled the world extensively, and the excitement of going someplace else just isn't there, as it used to be. It may be also that Lawrence has really joined the sophisticated outside world and has become much more interesting as a multicultural place than it was back in the tame old 1960s before the revolution. But I think it's also true that we have changed in response to an obviously more interrelated world, and that we have learned that it is plainly absurd to study about the far away and the long ago while ignoring where we live and the time we live in. Albert Camus, whom I read extensively as an undergraduate, and with much admiration, emphasized over and over in his work, such as The Plague, that we must be engaged in our world. And he criticized Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir for just sitting around and talking and refusing to get their hands dirty in the streets of Paris. My take on that today is that if we are not engaged in the here and now, in the place where we live, when and in what dream world can we be engaged? It just doesn't make sense to know about St. Petersburg, which we may never visit, and know almost nothing about the place we live in, Lawrence. This idea that we should know our place is not new. I was informed yesterday that 16th century German geographers apparently made the same argument, but only with the postmodern interest in regional history. Thinkers like James Malin and ideologists like Jerry Rubin have we begun to understand the worth of being here now. I want to point out to you, by the way, that this course is a biography of a city, and that is different than a history of a city, although biography is history, of course. Biography, however, is much more personal than history. As a biography, this course focuses much more on the human experience of a place and tells a story that is perhaps therefore less coherent than a historian would like. A biography may indeed be less coherent, but it is more like the lives as we live them. Not so constructed to give us an illusion that everything can be understood, that everything fits together, and that we can tie everything up in a bow. This is the way it was, and you better believe it. This is not the way a biography works, and not the way this biography of a city will work. This course will be delivered through many human hands and voices. This is the way it must be from my point of view, because it would be impossible for any single person to teach a course in the history of Lawrence at this stage. We know far too much and far too little about this city. Many people know a lot about bits and pieces of Lawrence history, but Lawrence has no master. While there are hundreds of histories of Rome, there is no single history of Lawrence that is readable, in my opinion. Just as this course is being taught for the first time, it is important to acknowledge that we are just at the beginning of understanding our place called Lawrence. And for that reason, you as students have much to contribute to our understanding of this city. First of all, you have your own experience of it, and that's very important. Second, because so little has been done, your projects will be primary rather than secondary in nature. No one, or at least very few people, will have gone before you, and what you unearth will not only be new, but extraordinarily valuable. I make no apologies for not covering everything. I make no apologies for constructing a course from my own subjective point of view of this city. The 30 people I've invited to speak and lend their points of view to this biography of Lawrence represent only a small number of people I would like to have invited. The subjects they will cover represent only a small biography of this city that ought to be covered more extensively, discovered, and interpreted. If you walk away saying, he didn't do this and he didn't do that, or he put too much emphasis on this and not enough emphasis on that, well, you don't understand that I would need 4 semesters to do an adequate job with the biography of Lawrence. Ironically, we might go away happier with a biography of Rome than with a biography of Lawrence. However, in my defense, I would say that I have not tried to construct any ideological point of view for you to swallow whole. I have tried to bring in many points of view. I have also tried to get us out of the 19th century as soon as possible and into the 20th century biography of this city, because we seem to know less, or at least we hear less about 20th century Lawrence. I just want to dust off the older topics and see how they pertain to us today. The purpose of this course is to give you the opportunity to become better acquainted with your adopted home through a variety of cultural lenses from the contributions of many faculty, and with the help of field and library projects that focus on Lawrence as an expression of a specific place in history, as well as a representative of many cities throughout the Great Plains. While the history of the city's cultural, social, economic, and political life is the foundation of this course, the essential interpretive question is the implication of our history on contemporary Lawrence and on the future of Lawrence. If you'll turn to the syllabus, I want to run through what is in front of us. I've been working on this syllabus since last May. It has evolved extensively over that period of time, and it continues to evolve. And I cannot promise that this course will unfold exactly as the syllabus suggests. Even our first session tonight will be different than I had planned, because Dr. Swann is down in the back and just could not make it to give his lively presentation tonight. I will have to carry him into the classroom perhaps next week, and we may well go beyond the 10 o'clock hour to catch up. As far as I know, there are no rules that say we have to stop just because the clock strikes 10. Most of the time we probably will. But if things get rowdy around here, as I hope they will, we may move beyond this bewitching hour. In any case, I will stand in for Dr. Swann tonight and introduce some of the geographical and cultural issues that continue to be determining factors in the biography of our city. Fundamentally, I hope to show you places that have been and still are, places that you perhaps have just floated by and take it for granted. By the time this course is over, I hope that it will be impossible for you ever to take Lawrence for granted again. I want you to begin to read the physical nature of the city and understand that this physical nature is as cultural as an open book for those who will look and are literate enough to read it. So more on that later. Next week in the second session, I've asked Paul Suewe, a well-known teacher at Lawrence High who has specialized in the Civil War history of Lawrence, to introduce us to the theme of Bleeding Kansas. Lawrence has always been a radical and outspoken city. People who came to found this city came in protest of slavery. They came to establish a free state, much to the chagrin of much of the nation, and especially to our neighboring state of Missouri. In my view, Lawrence is still a city of protest, a relatively liberal island in the vast conservative sea of Kansas, my native state. What happens in the initial period in the history of any city, or for that matter in the history of any individual, cannot be easily overcome, and usually continues to affect the future of a city or individual longer than most of us realize. The geographer Wilbur Zielinski has shown that what happens during the initial occupancy of a place is very difficult to change and overcome. And I believe this is the case not only for the occupancy of Lawrence, but for the psychology of Lawrence. Paul Suewe will set the stage of our city's initial psychology created in the experiences from about 1854 to 1865. Michael Swann, an urban geographer, will develop the history of how Lawrence was built from 1854 into the 1990s. This will be a daunting task, but I assure you that if anyone can do it, Mighty Mike can. In session 3, Dale Nimz, a historian and preservationist, will focus on East Lawrence, a very important part of our city that is often left out in traditional histories. Dale wrote a thesis about the buildings and people on several blocks of Rhode Island Street. And while these people and their buildings stem from the mid to late 19th century, certainly the neighborhood they created remains. There are more houses in East Lawrence built from the 1870s to the 1880s than in any other neighborhood in Lawrence. However, in part because these houses and the people who lived and still live there are generally from the working class or otherwise considered unworthy because of their ethnicity or race, East Lawrence has often not been respected by the white power structure. The East Lawrencians are a scrappy bunch, though, and Dale Nimz's presentation should reflect the early spunk of that part of the city. David Katzman, an intellectual historian who has specialized in the history of class, ethnicity, and work in American life, will look at the nature of work from many perspectives. If anything, a city is a workplace. And in order for a city like Lawrence to operate, people must accept all kinds of work to do, from plumbers to professors. And people must develop the skills to work in an ever-changing economy. Much of our human experience and many of our relationships are developed through work. And therefore, a significant part of our biography has been created by the sweat of our brows. And David will look at the sweat of our lives and how our struggles at work form the city in many of its dimensions. Now, in the biography of a city, there are certain biographies that are more significant than others. At least some biographies have more effect than others, and we return to them over and over again to re-examine their meaning. This is the kind of re-examination that is the core of Session 4, in which Debra Dandridge will look at John Brown, this time from an African-American point of view. And Richard Sheridan will look at William Quantrill. Debra Dandridge is a librarian who works in the Kansas collection in the Spencer Research Library. And she will be an important resource person for you as your own contribution to the biography of this city. Her topic, John Brown, brings the abolitionist movement to Kansas through the powerful person of Old Brown of Osawatomie, who revenged the slaughter of anti-slavers here by killing 5 pro-slavers in Potawatomi. Later, John Brown seized a government arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, called for a general uprising of slaves, and eventually was hanged for treason. The marching song, John Brown's Body, continues to ring in our minds today, and Debra will tell us why. Richard Sheridan, one of our most important economic historians, has spent years studying William Quantrill, the most infamous man in the biography of Lawrence, whom we hear about more frequently than all the other good men and women who have ever lived here in Lawrence since Quantrill's time. And while Quantrill and what he and his guerrilla band did in Lawrence are very important, we need to put Quantrill in proper perspective and seek to discover why we should hear about him so frequently, so much more often than any other human being in the history of Lawrence. Why? Katie Armitage will provide part of this perspective in Session 5 in her presentation on the widows, orphans, and survivals of Quantrill's raid and how they lived out their lives in the aftermath of that slaughter. Quantrill's raid really did not end on August 21st, 1863, except for the 80 or so people who were killed. And Katie will give us an enlightening story of the biographies that were directly affected by the killings. Katie is certainly one of our most knowledgeable local historians, and she is a scholar who publishes the revealing and surprising details of many 19th and early 20th century Lawrenceans. And you can spend hours with Katie. She really knows who did what, where they lived, and how they went about their lives. She's also published a guide to Lawrence houses that you'll find in your bibliography. Katie will bring this course then into the 20th century. And in the second half of that session, Steve Jansen, who's the director of the Watkins Community Museum at 11th in Massachusetts, will focus on the 2 20th century wars that shaped the biography of this city perhaps more than most of us realize. Wars of this magnitude bring fundamental, irrevocable change to a city, its culture, its technology, and to the lives of its people. The Gulf War of the early 1990s, one that got so much play on CNN, and the war most of you are most familiar with, is nearly meaningless in the biography of Lawrence compared to World War I and World War II. Steve Jensen will show the details of these changes. The 2 institutions that cannot be overlooked in the biography of Lawrence are the University of Kansas and Haskell Indian Nations University. Catherine Tuttle, who wrote her dissertation on the history of deans of women at KU, will show us in Session 6 how our town has been shaped by KU and whether the town has had any effect on KU. Is there really any significant town and gown relationship? Or has KU been more of a city on a hill unto itself that just happened to be in Lawrence? Professor Daniel Wildcat will address this problem and others in his presentation on Haskell, certainly the unique institution in the biography of Lawrence. Every Native American in this country knows about Haskell. But what do the rest of us know? And how is Haskell changing? The recent history of Haskell has been stirred greatly by the controversy over the South Lawrence Trafficway. And the pundits write that Haskell has been negatively affected by its staunch position on this issue. Is this really true? Or has this controversy brought Haskell front and center into the biography of Lawrence and into its rightful place. In session 7, Professor Elizabeth Schultz and Katie Armitage again will introduce one of our greatest sons, Langston Hughes, and will read his first novel, Not Without Laughter. This novel is an autobiographical account of his early days in Lawrence. Beth will discuss Lawrence through the eyes of Hughes, and Katie will show us slides of places Hughes refers to. This will be an exceptional session, I believe. Langston Hughes, after his time in Lawrence, where he lived with his grandmother, became one of the leaders of the Harlem Renaissance in New York, and Hughes was known for his poetry before he tried his hand at prose. Not Without Laughter was published in 1930, and it is as smooth as silk. In this novel, we will get firsthand how the biography of a city is affected by race and racism, certainly a part of the experience of many people who have lived in Lawrence. Any of us can relate to Hughes, whether we are black or not, through his lucid descriptions of his time. Listen to his first paragraphs of this novel. Anne Hagenwood stood in her doorway and looked out at the sun. The western sky was a sulphurous yellow, and the sun a red ball dropping slowly behind the trees and housetops. Its setting left the rest of the heavens gray with clouds. Storm's coming, said Aunt Hager aloud. A pullet ran across the backyard and into a square-cut hole in an unpainted piano box which served as the roosting house. An old hen clucked her brood together, and with the tiny chicks went into a small box beside the large one. The air was very still. Not a leaf stirred on the green apple tree. Not a single closed flower of the morning glories trembled on the back fence. The air was very still and yellow. Something sultry and oppressive made a small boy in the doorway stand closer to his grandmother, clutching her apron in his brown hands. We will follow our session on Hughes with a session on the 1950s in Lawrence. That includes a panel of insiders on William Burroughs. Ken Irby, professor of English in the English department, went to KU as an undergraduate in the 1950s, and he will relate through his firsthand experience what the university and the town were like in those halcyon days. We are told that the university was never better than at that time. But was that true? Did KU students really know what was going on in the world of the Beat generation? Or were they protected from all the wild and crazy stuff? Certainly one of the wildest was William Burroughs, who adopted our city in his later years and published a number of his books while living here. We'll read 2 of Burroughs' books, and we'll have the great opportunity to meet and discuss Burroughs with his close confidants, Jim McCrary, James Grauerholtz, Patricia Marvin, David Oley, and Wayne Probst. Why did Burroughs love Lawrence? How does an outsider like Burroughs become a part of the city? Most of us at one time were outsiders to Lawrence, and we've become part of the city's biography too, just as those who were born here. Many cities in Kansas can turn their backs on outsiders, not Lawrence. Session 9, Professor William Tuttle, will focus on the recurring insider-outsider problem of race and the struggle for equality in Lawrence. As an important historian of race, whose first book on the Chicago race riot of 1919 remains a classic text, Bill will give us a deeper look at the facts of racism in the Biography city. What happened? And who were the leaders for and against the equal treatment of all people, especially African Americans? I think you'll be surprised how some of our most revered leaders shored up the foundation of racism in the city and at the university and made sure the separate and unequal status of many people remained live and well into our time. Perhaps we all contribute in some ways to this experience in our city, and we need to be reminded of how easy it is to fall into this trap. Bill is going to bring up Will Chamberlain in this context. And then Norman Yetman, professor of American Studies and Sociology, will hook right into race by discussing Wilt the Stilt and the rationalization of sport in our society and at the university. Because of the Jayhawks, and sports figures have become major players in the biography of our city. Who can deny that James Naismith, Fogg Allen, Wilt Chamberlain, and many others brought the world's eyes upon us and have changed how we view ourselves? Who can deny that once sport was play, and now it is business that affects not only the young men and women who participate, but all of us who take part as spectators? Who can deny that the university has been fundamentally changed by sport, and that we wish we were a university our sports teams could be proud of? This will be a hot session. Even hotter will be session 10 on Lawrence in the 1960s. I can't think of any town that experienced more turmoil in the 1960s in Kansas than Lawrence. Certainly, the university had much to do with that. Not only did the race issue flare up and burn, but so did the KU Union in response to the tumult brought on by the Vietnam War. I was here in the 1960s, and it was scary, and it was exhilarating too. I don't know if Vern Miller, the Attorney General of Kansas, actually did jump out of the trunk of a car and make an arrest. But we all know that the National Guard moved in, enforced a curfew, and that 2 young men were killed here. We know that the computer center was bombed. We know that the windows of the military science building were broken out. We know that the ROTC marches were stopped, and that Chancellor Chalmers shut down the university after assembling the students in Memorial Stadium. No matter, it was the last student to be really engaged in the sense Albert Camus intended. And this engagement has been both vilified and lionized. Rusty Mulholland has written extensively about the 1960s in Lawrence, and as a historian, he will relentlessly lay out the facts of that time. Wayne Probst, one of the great geniuses of Lawrence and fantastic representative of the 1960s, will demonstrate through his own person just how zany things were in Lawrence. Wayne remains just as zany today, and for good reason. Now, things began to settle down to a dull roar in the 1970s with the sexual revolution in full swing, and with Lawrence growing like it was pregnant. In session 11, Barclay Clark, a former mayor of Lawrence and former professor at KU, will talk about how the city was expanded without losing its identity as a special place. Barclay and a very few others were responsible for the creation of Plan 95 that made sure we retained our historic 19th century downtown as our central business district. Lawrence could have been mauled out of existence, or at least mauled into another existence, had it not been for visionaries like Barclay Clark. Plan 95 successfully helped Lawrencians keep shopping centers from destroying what most cities in America gleefully destroyed in the 1970s. I will follow his presentation with a discussion of the new city of Lawrence called Albemarle, primarily west of Iowa, and compare and contrast this new suburb with the old suburb of Old West. I will look at the physical properties of the new and the old, examine houses in both places, and report on people who live in each of these places and why. I hope to show that while there have to be similarities, the people who live in these two different places also live different lives. In session 12, Professor Barry Schenck will bring the biography of Lawrence of the 1980s and 1990s with the development of Lawrence as one of the centers of contemporary American music. Lawrence is now a required stop for musicians who hope for national recognition in the culture of popular music. And Professor Shank has written a book about the music scene and the creation of music reputations at one of the other stops, Austin, Texas. Barry will report on a number of interviews he intends to conduct, as well as analyze the contemporary cultural process. In the second half of the session, Professor Dan Rockhill will comment on how new ideas in American architecture are affecting new buildings in Lawrence, especially his own. Now, Dan's work cannot be ignored. You either hate it or you love it. And Dan has managed to upset many a stick in the mud with not only the form of his buildings, but also the new materials he is using. Of all the forms of art, Lawrencians seem to be the most ignorant of architecture and almost belligerently opposed to new architectural ideas. Why is a very good question. Some more difficult questions will be raised by the presenters in session 13. Donald Worster, our distinguished historian of the environment, will put Lawrence in its wider environmental context and give us a forecast of its future. Lawrence is part of the Great Plains geographically, and what we have done to develop this region is astonishing in its scope and its depth. In the face of environmental history and what we know about the consequences of past development, what can we expect? Will there be anything left for generations to come? Mark Buehler, currently the chairman of the Douglas County Commission, will bring other views and opinions about developments in Lawrence and Douglas County. Mark is in his second term on the commission, and he has been the commission's advocate for such developments as the South Lawrence Trafficway. He has also been very concerned about rural development, particularly in relation to access to adequate water supplies in rural areas, the scattering and sprawling of that, and the issue of private roads. From the point of view of someone in the trenches, we will learn that nothing is easily cut and dried now or in the future of Lawrence. This discussion then will bring us to session 14 with presentations about current politics, power structures, and who is really in control of the future of our city. Steve Lopes is a genius at building political power in Lawrence's neighborhoods, and as far as I can tell, he's afraid of nothing. He will give us a shot of truth serum through his many experiences of standing up, facing off against both elected officials and the moneyed elite who make or try to make their image of the future city happen. Burdett Loomis will follow Steve's discussion with an analysis of the power structure, who the many voices are that are speaking out, and for what issues. And finally, who's calling the tunes in the current biography of this city. The clear point of view that Steve Lopes is likely to take will be balanced out by Burdett Loomis as he lays out many opposing views and opinions. Finally, in our wrap-up session on April 28th, Professor Cheryl Lester from the American Studies and English departments will lead a group of Lawrence poets in a poetry slam. Cheryl instituted these poetry slams a number of years ago, and I suspect the poets she brings to us on that evening will capture not only their intense experiences of living and loving Lawrence, but will also represent many of our own feelings and views that we will have developed through our semester-long examination of this fascinating city. I look forward, you do, to all these sessions, and I hope you will please stay tuned. Thank you. So that's the end of our first lecture session. This evening I'm standing in for Dr. Michael Swann, an urban geographer who I think would be more qualified to make this presentation than I am. However, I've spent quite a number of years with Dr. Swann, and we've written a book together having to do with the geography of Lawrence, particularly the hinterlands around Lawrence, and I would like to begin that today. Could we go to the Elmo, please? This is a map of Kansas and its landforms. And the area that we're concerned with is in eastern Kansas here. Lawrence would be about right in this spot. Actually, Lawrence is a more interesting part of the state geographically than one might expect. Generally, the idea is that Lawrence is a flat, all of Kansas is flat, and you can see for miles and miles without any interruption that there is no relief. That, however, is not the case. There is a great deal of relief. You'll see that this area is not flat and hilly at all. Indeed, up in the northeast part of Kansas, all the way down to just north of Lawrence, is the area of glaciation which occurred, and it changed the topography of the land, making it very uneven, and filling in then a lot of the land with so-called glaciated till up to 100 miles deep. And it also left great numbers of stones and rocks. And one of them, let's go to the slide right now. Can we go to the slide? One of them was this Chungamunga rock, which is down in Robinson Park, right at the end of Massachusetts Street. This rock is very interesting as a landscape device because this was a Kansas Indian prayer rock. This was a holy rock that was near Chungamunga Creek in Topeka, and in 1929, because of some publicity that was done in the Topeka Daily Capital about that rock, Lawrence, the fathers of Lawrence, stole over in the night with a train and a car with a bed, and took that 20-ton rock place where Kansas Indians went to pray, and brought it over here and set it up in this park the way it is now. This is sort of what I would call a transmogrified landscape. Indeed, the chancellor of the university at that time, I believe it was Chancellor Snow, is standing in that picture. It's one of those erratic stones that was brought in by the glacier. The other interesting aspect of Lawrence is that there are a lot of uneven and high hills. For example, there's Mount Orion, there's Mount Blue. There's also Shank Hill, which is out south of town. And these escarpments raise up sort of unexpectedly off of the floor of the Kansas River and the Wakarusa River. These all used to be at the same plane. They used to be sort of straight across. And over a long period of time, thousands and thousands of years, through erosion of the Wakarusa and the Kaw and other rivers, they were cut down the way they are now. They used to be, Mount Orion used to be much higher than it is now. And over these thousands of years of erosion, it has been cut down. But that's why we have a place like Mount Orion, Blue Mound, and Shank Hill that gives us this relief, and we don't have this kind of flatness that might be expected. Rather, we have the escarpments. Let's go back now to the slides. This is a Port Kansas according to the flora that has grown in Kansas over thousands of years. This part of Kansas is sort of where the woods and the prairie come together. Depending on the amount of rainfall that occurs from east to west in Kansas, you get different kinds of prairies. This is a very tall grass prairie here. When the pioneers came in the 1850s to this part of Kansas, and even before that when they came through Kansas on the Santa Fe Trail as early as 1825, they found this ocean of grass. More than 90% of this landscape was covered by grass. Less than 10% had edge woods of oak and walnut and sycamore and sort of thing. And these grasslands, these tall grasslands, were 7 foot high and higher. So it really was like an ocean of grass. If a little kid got off of the wagon and walked out into the grass, it was easy for him or her to get lost, and many were lost. So this is not such a simple place as might have been expected by many people who've never been to Kansas before. I'm back on the slides again. As I said, many people came to Kansas on the early trails, and those are significant markers in the geography and landscape of eastern Kansas. One of the trails went across South Douglas County. It was the Santa Fe Trail, went across the South Douglas County, and another trail, the Oregon Trail, off about at DeSoto and went north and came across Mount Oread, came across the Baker-Haskell wetlands, came across Mount Oread. There's a place that you can see, a memorial kind of to the Oregon Trail, right close to the Lindsay Hall. I think you've seen that. And that trail went on across then and hooked into the California Trail. The California Trail went from St. Joe across to the northern part of Kansas and hooked in with the Oregon Trail and then went on north into Nebraska. There were all these trails then that were markers, geographical parts of the landscape that human beings used. There, of course, were many trails before that. This area of Kansas has been populated for tens of thousands of years by native peoples. And particularly the Wakarusa is filled with a number of Native American sites that anthropologists and geologists have looked at. In addition to those trails, which were all over, the military particularly had trails going north and south. Of course, they went east and west as well. But Fort Leavenworth was established in the early 19th century, and trails down to south in Kansas and west were extant by the time many of the pioneers got here in 1854 by way of the trails. The Santa Fe Trail then goes through the south of Douglas County, and the Oregon Trail goes through the north, and those were very important aspects of the geography of this place during the early period. Now, who came to this part of the country? It's not a myth, of course, that this was established by the New England Immigrant Aid Society for purposes opposing slavery. It was an abolitionist group. They wanted to name Lawrence New Boston. They wanted to name Lawrence Yankeetown. People opposed that, apparently. And there were not all that many New Englanders who came. There were, particularly in Lawrence. I want to go to the slide again. Particularly in Lawrence. Here is linguistic analysis of the people who came to Douglas County, and all of those dots in the various townships of Douglas County represent 50 people from who spoke a language in 1880 that was not English. Lawrence itself was a very multiple place. in the 1880s. By the time the people from the New England Immigrant Aid Society got here in 1854, a lot of the land that they had scouted out before and decided to turn into Lawrence, a lot of that was already squatted on by people from Tennessee, Kentucky, and Missouri. By the 1870s and 1880s, 30% of the people who lived in Lawrence were not white. A lot of them were blacks, exodusters who came out of the South and came to Lawrence and Kansas because of the reputation it had as a free state and looking for new lives to begin. So, and Lawrence was not laid out like a New England town was laid out. It had no central green. It looked more like Chicago. It was laid out on a grid. So if you looked at Lawrence in the 1870s and 1880s, particularly East Lawrence, you find that there weren't that many people from New England. I'm not saying that there weren't any from New England, but to a certain extent, the people of Lawrence were mythologized in that people believe this is a New England town, when in fact there really is very little evidence to suggest, either by the numbers of people who came or by the way in which the town was built and the main influences on the town. Very little of that had to do with New England. But it doesn't mean that the myth of New England didn't have an important effect on the subsequent history of Lawrence. It certainly did. If you look at the land holdings in Douglas County around 1940, you can see that the light gray areas are people who basically were German in their national origin. And in the dark areas are people who, except for Lawrence, which I think I can get a pointer going. I'm not sure if I can do a pointer on this yet. Here we are. That's Lawrence right there. And these areas here were all populated mainly by Germans. This is Palmyra Township, and this is Willow Springs Township. This is Marion. Particularly Willow Springs was populated in 1854 by Dunkers, people out of Pennsylvania, Germans, also people directly out of Germany. Willow Springs Township had 3 different large German groups centered around churches and in their own neighbors. The people at St. John's, for example, those children studied German in the German school that was connected to the St. John's Church until World War I, when they had to shut it down because of the worry about German spies. But in my studies of Willow Springs Township, into the early 1990s, there were people in their 90s at that time who spoke German to me in interviews. So all the rest of these areas are populated by English speakers more than other ethnic groups. But you can see there were significant numbers of people who didn't identify either with New England or with any other English-speaking group in this county and in Lawrence. And I think we should take that into consideration as we talk about Lawrence in the future. Lawrence, of course, was a city that had to be a part of a larger system, a larger geographical system, a larger land system. The land system of 1785, devised by Thomas Jefferson, was a very Renaissance rational system, quite unlike what the system of land development that created a place like Boston, which was a medieval land system that was much more organic than the meets and bounds system that we have in most of the United States west of the Alleghenies. It was a township and range system, and the townships were divided then into 640-acre sections of land. And those 648 sections of land very rationally could be subdivided into 320 acres. And those 320 acres could be subdivided into 160 acres, and the 180 and 80 to 40. meaning that people could purchase the amount of land that they could afford, and they could identify exactly where that land was based on measurements set out in lines established in Ohio. So that all land around Lawrence, and Lawrence was certainly a part of that. The hinterland was very important to Lawrence. All land around Lawrence was divided and subdivided in this way, in a kind of a very American equality, egalitarian approach to land. Let's go to the next slide. What that did, and I'm sorry that you can't see this one too well, but what that land system basically did was scatter people in ways that they were not used to living. Most Europeans came from village cultural life, in which everybody lived sort of in a cluster, particularly in Germany. There were different kind of towns. There were street towns, there were circular towns, there were cluster towns. People lived in the town. And then they went out to, as farmers or peasants, they went out to their land holdings and did their work, and then they came back to the town. They were very tightly bound together in community fashion. But this new land system around Lawrence, and Lawrence was the economic center for that land system, that's why I'm emphasizing it. This new land system in Lawrence scattered people across great distances, creating a great deal of loneliness and a need to establish a kind of different kind of community. This is the kind of distance that you see out in Willow Springs Township today. And those distances farther away when there was nothing but prairie out there. A lot of people got sick, like seasick, over these distances because grandma wasn't there and there were no neighbors. If you're set up in 640, 320, 600, 160 acre tracts or smaller, your nearest neighbor could be a quarter of a mile away, a half a mile away, could be even as far as a mile away. In the late 1860s, 1870s, a lot of this area really hadn't been settled, or it had been settled by speculators who didn't live on the land, so you didn't have close neighbors. So there had to be some system of developed of community, both for economic purposes, for religious purposes, and for schooling. And this was a new concept to the game. Let's go to the next slide, please. Yes, this is not going to show very well, but can we go to camera 4? What happened is that everyone out there in the middle of Douglas County basically was going to eventually, when you had a market economy, they were going to use Lawrence as their main marketing destination. But they all lived on their own pieces of property. Maybe it was 160 acres, maybe it was 320 acres, maybe it was 80 acres. And that is what I've called the near distance. That's their own farmland, that's their property. Everybody had that near distance. And on that near distance, they built their houses, which the first houses were usually log, both in the country and in the city. They built their barns, which they often built before they built their houses, or at least more substantial. They fenced it all in. But within 3 miles, within a middle distance, what I call a middle distance of 3 miles, they had to have a church, they had to have a school, and they had to have a country store in order to operate in a normal kind of social system that they were used to. Generally, the church was the center of these neighborhoods anyway. 3 miles. I established 3 miles by looking at Willow Springs Township very carefully over a period of years, and you always have these things within 3 miles. Can you imagine if you had to walk farther than that to school on a cold, wintry day in a windswept Kansas prairie, and you were 7 or 8 or 9 years old? Hardly go 3 miles. even the schools, you usually found them more frequently than 3 miles because kids just couldn't walk that far. Churches could be a little farther away perhaps, but almost always they were within 3 miles because people would go to church on Sundays in buggies. And Saturday mornings, they went to do their Saturday morning shopping at the country store. And that could be 3.5 miles easily because the whole family would go together unless the man went by himself. Very often the sense of loneliness out on this vast geography of Douglas County and around Lawrence, very often the men went to town. The men went to the country store, leaving the women and the children at home, increasing the sense of loneliness. So there really was a different experience for women in this geography often than there was for men. But they had to do school several times a week. They had to go to church once a week, and they had to do their bartering, usually for staples that they couldn't create on their subsistence farms, like salt and flour and that sort of thing. They had to do that once a week. Very often, though, they didn't go to the main marketing city, Lawrence, more than once or twice a year. And that main marketing city, whether it was in Lawrence or whether it was in some other part of the state, had to be within about 10 miles. Because 10 miles was about all you could do in a single day's drive. You could go, take you 2.5 to 3 hours. If you're in the middle of Willow Springs Township, let's say 10 miles away, it took you about 3 hours with an empty wagon to get to Lawrence. Then you did your trading in Lawrence. It was a really big deal. If everyone tried to go to town at least once a year, it was a really big deal to go to town. Then with a loaded wagon, it took longer to get back. You couldn't go to town that often because of the amount of time it took. Later on, around the turn of the century, my study of Dunkers in Willow Springs Township says that sometimes they went to town 2 or 3 times a week because they had changed their economy. They had changed from a subsistence economy to a market economy, and they were selling on a regular basis wheat that was shipped off then by train to Chicago, Kansas City, St. Joe. Or they were selling wood, particularly in the wintertime, and they would go to town maybe a couple times a week to participate in this burgeoning market economy, which Silas McCormick called Chicagoland. Chicago was the great central city of the plains, and an interconnected transportation web. Chicago could reach all the way down to the near distance by the 1880s and 1890s. And what you produced in the near distance, the amount of wheat you produced, the corn you produced, the cattle you slaughtered, which you would drive 10 miles to Baldwin or to Lawrence, that meat could be shipped all the way to Chicago, which was the great center. So I guess what I'm trying to point out to you, that in this geography, it was very quickly, within about 30 years of first settlement, 1854 to about 1885, this was a completely developed network for marketing goods and produce that was created on the vast farms that covered Douglas County and most of Kansas. And Lawrence was a node in that economic chain that was very important. And without Lawrence, this is Walter Kristoller's central place theory, without Lawrence connecting to the near distance, to Chicago, these people could not have made it out there in the hinterland. Nor could Lawrence have existed and survived without them producing and coming to the city and exchanging their goods for services and things that they couldn't purchase at the country store. Now, of course, this network changed dramatically with the development of the combustion engine, so that by 1925, many farmers had already bought their first car, generally from Henry. And by 1935, most farmers had their first combustion tractor, which meant that they could plant more and more crops. And they could produce more and more in the market economy. And the market economy then changed from the previous barter economy to a money economy. And it also changed the road systems, which is a part of the geography. On that grid that they developed to disperse land in an egalitarian way, on that grid of 160 acres and 320 acres and 640 acres, that's where the roads were. And those roads were created depending on how many people lived along them. And early on in this system, in order to pay your poll tax, you had to work the roads. You had to drag them yourself. But that wasn't good enough by the 1920s and 1930s. So then the townships began to purchase big machinery to do it. So the way in which people actually interacted with the geography and worked within this economic network changed because of technological change. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. So here's one of those little country churches that had to be within 3 miles of somebody's house out there in Willow Springs or out in Marion Township. Here's one of those little country stores. This is the Flory store in Lone Star. That church was the Dunker Church out in Willow Springs. That had to be every few miles. And there were a whole lot of those country stores, very few of which are left at this point. There had to be then that little school as well, generally a one-room schoolhouse, that people used and went about 8 years before they graduated and seldom went beyond that schooling. Now, school didn't last very long in those early days, only about 4 months in the beginning. And for the boys, they often didn't last more than 5 or 6 months, even when generally school was running 9, because boys had to work in this market economy. So boys often were 21 years old before they finished 8 years of school. And they were in the same single-room schoolhouse with children who were 6 and 7 and 8. So the one-room school was a very different educational device than we have today. And it may be that the one-room school as an educational, a place for education, is to what we have today. And we could go into that in the discussion session if you should be interested. So there were a lot of little towns outside of Lawrence in this chain. You can't see this too well, but if I just zoom in, you can get the sense that there were big towns, there were medium-sized towns, there were little tiny towns where you might just have a cluster of the church, school, and the country store. Like here in Willow Springs. This was a little town right on the Santa Fe Trail. Willow Springs was one of the most important stops on the Santa Fe Trail. It had a great spring. And when you go to Willow Springs today, the water is still running. I don't care how dry it gets. That spring is big enough to drive a wagon into. You can lose your car in it. And that's a very important stop on the Santa Fe Trail. And around that stop developed a country store. And individuals speculated on town building. And they purchased 320 acres, which they could get under the laws of land dispersal for a town, and they tried to attract the other amenities of the town. There was a lot of boosterism. You know, this is a great town to come to. We have a church, we have a school, we have a mill, we have a creamery. All of these things existed at Willow Springs. But to a large extent, these little tiny towns only existed in the imaginations of people who wanted to build them. And we saw those kinds of towns throughout Douglas County by the dozens. And most of them had disappeared by the turn of the 20th century. And certainly by 1950, almost all of them were gone because people didn't need that kind of town anymore. They just drove to Lawrence. They still had schools throughout the county until the consolidation of schools in the 1960s, which turned out to be some of the biggest battles that ever occurred in Douglas County and throughout Kansas, was the consolidation of schools and the loss of that dispersed community life and the centralization then on a city like Lawrence. Today, out in Douglas County, all the kids come to high school in Lawrence. They usually go to grade school in Lawrence too, or bus to Baldwin. So that kind of geography really has changed dramatically in Douglas County over this past 130 years. Let's go to the next slide, please. But in the near distance, even today, you still have remnants of these early farms that did so well in that market economy. And of course, when I say remnants, I mean that a lot of them have now been simply abandoned, because the 160-acre farm that was supportable in the economics of the 19th century is no longer supportable. Most of the farmers out in Willow Springs that are really farming are doing now 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 acres of farming with huge machines. But a place out in Willow Springs like this on the Flory Homestead, you can see, I hope, that there are some 25 buildings around that house, all in a cluster. And this is what the near distance is all about, and that has been slowly eliminated. Now, the main house type of the 19th century that these farmers built, got their lumber eventually after they built their first house, the log. They replaced it with a hall and parlor house, or a so-called I house, that has its origins in East Anglia in England. These folk houses were brought here in the minds of people, and they were brought also in the books about building, so-called pattern books. And so people tended to build very much the same. So this is the kind of house that represented great economic success in the countryside. When I say this, call this as an I house as a type, that really means a house that is 2 rooms wide, 1 room deep, and 2 stories high. And it can have 3 bays, that is 2 windows and a central door, or it can have 5 bays, a central door, and 2 windows on each side. And the plan for this house is that you go into a hall entryway. And that is used generally by everyone who lives in the house rather informally, at least initially. And then on the side you have a parlor, which is the Victorian parlor, which is used for special occasions. When the minister comes, when somebody dies, when there's a wedding, if there is a kind of gathering after a baptism, you might use the parlor, which would be the most decorated part of the house and the most delicately attended to part of the house, but would be seldom used. Let's go to the next slide. So here you can see the I house there to your left, which is the 2-story porch. And behind that I house then is an L, is a kitchen L that comes out the back of it. That's where the kitchen was, and that's where the back porch is. Then you have additions sometimes later. That last addition to your right, that is a technology called the indoor toilet. That in Willow Springs and large portions of Douglas County didn't occur until after World War II. I know a person who didn't put one in until 1970. And the reason he didn't put it in because he hadn't yet paid off his house. He wasn't going to extend himself even to get an indoor toilet. That's the kind of conservatism people, particularly the Germans, had out there in the countryside. But this is an I house with a kitchen L, and this was a very typical house in the near distance in Douglas County in the 19th century, clear into World War II, at which time, if you were very successful, you replaced this house with a rancher. Yes? Like you find out here in West Lawrence. Now, there were some strange variations at times, ethnic variations to the I house, like this I house with 2 front doors instead of 1 single door. That's a German variation that is kind of atavistic. And that goes clear back to the Middle Ages in Germany when, and you can still find it today, of course, in Germany, all over Germany, in which one part of the house was used for animals and the other part of the house was used for human beings. Then with the creation of cities that surrounded these old farms, you no longer kept your animals in the house, in the barn house. But architecture is such a conservative cultural experience that often you stuck to the form even though the use had changed. So these 2 front doors really represent something that happened long ago that's no longer the case. In this particular case, one side goes directly into this Victorian parlor, and the other side goes into the hallway dining area that you might find behind the other door. But even today, if you went up to that house, and that's the parsonage at St. John's Church just north of Warden, even today if you went up to that house, you'd find a little note that said, "Go to the back door." There's the amount of informality that we now see in the countryside compared to Victorian life in the 19th century is incredible. Nobody, even if they were still using those 2 doors, you wouldn't know which one to knock on. But in any case now, you go to the back door like everybody does. So that's a slight variation in the I house that's German-speaking areas. This I house also exists in Lawrence, by the way. The kind of barns, the most important agricultural factories that existed and were built in Douglas County, there's still many to be seen. I wonder if I could get that on the Elmo. See if we can look at those a little bit better. Could we go to the Elmo now, please? I don't know if that's any better, but maybe I can zoom in on them and move my paper around. The most typical barn that we find in the countryside today, if we don't look at the later Butler buildings and metal barns, is this so-called English barn with a side entry. This is a throughway barn. You open that middle door and you drive in and you park and go to both sides. You also have horse stalls, which are very different from the cattle milking stalls. And generally then you have a granary on the other side. And then upstairs is for hay. And you can see the hay hood right here, which denotes that there's quite a large fork that comes down and picks up the loose hay, pulls it up out of the wagons, takes it across a rail here on the inside of that barn, and dumps it down into the upper loft. That's a very typical kind of barn you see in the countryside even today, although they're not often used. Another kind of barn that you see very frequently is this 4-bay barn here with a silo. This is the 4-bay right there. This is a German bank barn. You drive in to, again, a central alley on this side, and this is a thrashing area here. This is the 2nd floor, and on one side is a granary. On the other side is storage of all sorts of things, maybe tack for the horses. And this will then be loaded clear to the top with hay. Down below then is where the animals come in. And milking is done down here, and the horses are kept down here. The Germans tended to bring all their animals inside, as opposed to the English, who often did not do that. So this barn is really very much larger often than the English counterpart here. Another barn that we see very frequently is this so-called cattle barn in the countryside. And this goes clear back to the Romans. This shape with a clear story like that goes clear back to the Romans. This is a cattle barn, and generally...
I'm going to move it over.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Thank you. This cattle barn hay will be, here you can see the hay door, and this cattle barn will be loaded clear to the top with hay. And then around here, cattle will be fed both this direction and that direction and in the back side. So those are the three main barns. You also see the raised barn, which comes out of New York in response to, move that up, in response to changes in the way in which dairy farming was done. And you see clusters of barns like this, where you get a whole group of factories in which the product and produce of those farms is created and stored so that it can be moved on into a place like Lawrence, which is the economic center. Okay, let's go to the next slide then, away from Elmo. This is not a very good slide on this particular production, but if I could sort of walk you through it, this is the kind of the life geography that a person like Harv Flory had in the 1900s. His middle distance is that internal circle that's a little bit lighter. The square is where he lived. That's his near distance. Within that lighter distance, everything that he needed to conduct his life was possible. The next circle then was the far distance, which is where he went to Lawrence. And he never went to the remote distance. He never left 10 miles from his home. Now, if I were to develop that for you, if you lived out in Willow Springs Township now, or let's say I did it for myself, my far distance really goes around the world. His far distance went as far as Lawrence. My far distance goes as far as Hong Kong. I frequently go to Europe. I often go to Berlin. I go almost anywhere within 15 or 20 hours. So technological change, changes in communication, all of that has changed the way in which the hinterlands relate to our city called Lawrence. And all by the 1880s was tied up firmly in property, and everything was fenced. Everything was fenced in or fenced out. And there were all sorts of fences that we still see today. Let's see if the Elmo is any better. Can we go to Elmo, please? Generally, this is the kind of fence that was made. The first fences, because of barbed wire at that point, we didn't have barbed wire until the 1870s, the mid-1870s. The first fences were generally stones that the glaciers had left in the fields, and they were cleared by the farmers, and they're relatively small fields. Then by the 1870s, things were really fenced in much more rapidly by barbed wire. The Consolidated Barbed Wire Company was in Lawrence, Kansas, run by Albert Henley, whose house we'll see a little bit tonight. We'll also see the Consolidated Barbed Wire Factory. It consolidated all the barbed wire manufacturing west of the Mississippi by 1880, and made him one of the multimillionaires who then built a grand house in Old West Lawrence, which you'll see tonight. But this is the kind of fences that we have. The two-pronged barbed wire with wood posts was very often the fence. Sometimes you had 4, sometimes you had 5 barbs, like this one. You could really fence in the whole territory and keep animals in, and because you know the roads, until 1829, you could run cattle up and down the common roads all you wanted to. And often cattle were driven to market, were driven to Lawrence, were driven to Baldwin by cattle drivers who came around and picked up the cattle. So until 1929, you really had to keep things fenced. Now there was a monumental defencing after World War II that changed the countryside dramatically. They bulldozed down a lot of the hedgerows. They eliminated the rock walls by grinding them up and putting them into gravel roads, because they turned the dirt roads to gravel. And they didn't need the small fields anymore. They needed very large fields to respond to the new economies of scale. And so there was a tremendous bulldozing and eliminating offenses after World War II that significantly changed how the countryside looked. Okay, let's go back to the slides, please. So here we are in Lawrence. The earliest drawing we have of Lawrence. Lawrence is then the central place for this economy to grow. And you can see that Lawrence is right there in the bend of a river, fairly flat here. Now, when the New England Immigrant Society bought their land from the Delaware and the Wyandotte chief said that he remembered in 1844 a flood that stretched all the way from Blue Mound clear to the other side of the escarpment on the north side of the Kansas River, and that they ought to be careful with this place. The founders, particularly in North Lawrence, didn't pay much attention to this. They built their railroads, they built their small little houses of several types, lean-to, which you can see there. There are also log houses there. There are plank houses there. And there's even a sod house there. And up in the right-hand corner, if I can get my pointer going here, up in the right-hand corner was the first industry. I can't. Here we go. Up in the right-hand corner was a sawmill, which was very important to the development of Lawrence, early Lawrence. But here you see this big bend in the river that we know so well. And Lawrence, as a topography, was relatively flat. It didn't have kind of a shelf like you'd find in St. Joe, Missouri, or even a bluff that you'd find in Kansas City. It just was a gentle slope going up here on the south side. And then on the north side, where North Lawrence is now, always very flat. And this is the area that the Indian chief said, it floods, and when it floods, everything is going to be destroyed. Nobody paid much attention to that. And indeed, we didn't have much of a flood until the 20th century. Then we had a whole series of floods, and 1951 was the last big flood, which created a great geographical change in our topography around Lawrence. That was the beginning of the development of the big lakes. Eventually, we did get Clinton, we got Perry Lake, we got some 25 lakes up the Kaw River in order to hold that water back. Also, beginning in the late 1960s through 1980, the dike system was built around North Lawrence that you see. It was a kind of a circular dike. The water can still come back in. If it's high enough, it comes around and comes back in. And they've been to eliminate water through pumping in North Lawrence. But still, that was a significant part of Lawrence's history. And we were talking earlier about trauma. Certainly, the flood trauma in Lawrence was great. But the main houses of the early type of houses are all there to be seen. And in courses that I teach in vernacular architecture, we go into that in great detail. Basically, though, Lawrence, this is looking north on the hill, probably about where you're sitting tonight. This is what Lawrence looked like. It was a prairie. This was the topography of Lawrence in 1854, and it lasted that well into the late 19th century. This is looking then south, standing on the top of the hill, overlooking the south of Lawrence, and it's anything but a suburban landscape that we see today. There really were small farms all fenced in. And generally, houses of very predictable kinds. Now, this is an 1869 bird's eye view of Lawrence, which is not a very good slide for television, but nevertheless, I think we can learn something from it. If I can get my pointer to go, I'll try to work on it. This is downtown Lawrence. This is the main bridge. This is the Howell Truss Bridge, first bridge across Lawrence that was built in 1864. Then the first railroad bridge was built across in 1867. Coming right down here is Massachusetts Street. And this is East Lawrence. And this is Old West Lawrence. And right there was a huge ravine that has been filled up and is that park now where the locomotive is sitting. That was all filled up, but before that was a huge ravine that you crossed a bridge to get across into one of the new suburbs 1860s and 1870s Old West Lawrence, which we will look at in some detail later. Basically, the topography is this. This is about 800, this is East Lawrence, and it's the lowest part of Lawrence. It's about 820 feet above sea level. As you get up to here, which is the Eldridge House, it's about 850. Up here on the hill, right here, this was the first building, Old North Hall in Lawrence. This was over almost 1,100 feet above sea level. So what happened here, based on the topography, is the rich people settled the high ground, and the working population and the poor people settled the low ground. And that's pretty much the way it always works in Kansas cities. And so when this big river flooded, you can bet that these people got wiped out every time. And these people North Lawrence, you could forget them. The people in Old West Lawrence probably retained their houses. I don't ever recall seeing floodwaters up that high. But this was all gone down here. And this is the way geography, topography, and social life work. The poor get the lowland, and the high get the highland. And that worked in Lawrence and was a very important part of the geography, not only early on, but even today. The high and the low is still there. They're still there. This was the early Howell Truss Bridge, 1864. It was really important to be able to get across the river. And you had to pay a toll to get across this river. And this was a wooden bridge. This was a powerful bridge. And it was, of course, has been replaced by any number of bridges. And the last bridges, now we have a two-lane bridge going across, sweeping across. But this bridge changed the geography of Lawrence and what could happen. You had the railroads coming in by the 1860s. The Santa Fe was here by the early 1870s. The Union Railroad was here by the 1860s, and that was on the north side of the tracks, and the Santa Fe on the south side. And that transportation system was very, very important in the Chicago land that connected to all of the hinterlands of Kansas and Missouri, and a vast network of places throughout the Central Plains. Let's go to the next slide, please. So here we have Lawrence.
You've got about 5 minutes.
Thank you. Here we have Lawrence in the 1870s with a lot of cattle there. This is the main street right on Massachusetts. This is in the 1880s, it had changed. But downtown was the place where everybody went to do the exchange that was required in order to make the market economy work. And basically you had commercial buildings that were on 177-foot lots with 14-foot alleys, 50-foot wide or 20-foot wide. And they changed rapidly, basically fairly quickly over a period of 100 years or so. Those businesses would, although they would be universal spaces on the inside, you could have very many different businesses in and out as the economics of those businesses worked or didn't work. But they all more or less looked like this, which is the round corner drug store about 1900, with goods on the exterior walls and some central cabinets on the interiors, with generally 2 or 3 men, generally men, sometimes women, working those businesses. Businesses like this, which were established up near the river. This is the flour mill. They were either powered by coal or they were powered by water power that came out of the Bowersock mill by cables, which is really an intriguing motive system that ran places like this. This is the Consolidated Barbed Wire Factory that A.C. Henley built into a $1 million business in the 1880s. And the Bowersock Mill, which J.D. Bowersock purchased in the late 1870s, is still creating electricity for our grid. It's still working. That one isn't showing much. Now, if we look at some of the house types, let's go to Elmo again. if we look at some of the house types in Lawrence, we'll find that, do we have the Elmo? We'll find that the most frequent 19th century house is this 2/2 house, which we have still a lot of in East Lawrence. We did, and we do still have a few of these I houses, but generally we found those in the country. The next frequent house type is this kind, so-called the bent house. You've seen that as well. And the next frequent house type is the 4/4 house, which was simply just a little bit bigger, or the 4 square house was just a little bit bigger than the 2/2 house. If I could show that right there. Those are the main kinds of houses we saw in the 19th century. And then for the really rich people, we had the Queen Anne. We have a lot of those in Old West Lawrence, and I'll show a few of those. Let's go to the slides again. Here's a 2/2 house. We get in real close. This is on Rhode Island Street. It's still standing there. It was just put on the local register. When I say 2/2, that is, you have 2 rooms below and 2 rooms above, and it's very simple. You come into a hall, and it's also the parlor. This is a working man's house. The kitchen is behind. Later on, you might get an extension, but initially the kitchen is behind, and sleeping is upstairs. This is the most frequent house in 19th century Lawrence, and we still have a lot of them. Then we have this bent house, and basically, this is a Victorian house where the parlor, you go into the left, and the kitchen, you go into the right, or vice versa. You have a variant of that, a little earlier variant. This is so-called an upright, an L, and the parlor goes right into this temple front that you see facing you, and this is in Old West Lawrence. Here's the 4/4 house. This is at 21 Winona. They're in Breesedale at the end of 23rd Street. There are a whole lot of those. And there you have 4 rooms downstairs. You come into a hall and a stairway up, and then you have a threshold going into the living room. And then right behind the hallway, you have the kitchen. And then off the kitchen to the right, you have the dining area. And then eventually you may get an extension. But this was built very frequently, and Sears developed it and sold it by catalog in the early 20th century.
One more minute.
Thank you. You also have the hall parlor house, which is a working class house. Very frequently, this is just a hall parlor cottage, not even 2 stories. And you use one side as a formal room, the other room as the informal room, and then a shed extension out the back. Then you have these great houses in Old West Lawrence. This is at 713 Louisiana, the widest street in the residential area in Lawrence, and there are a whole lot of these houses. And their plans look very much like this. That is, you have this was a visiting society, and you have a very elaborate hallway entry, generally with hearths. And most of these first floor rooms have their own hearths, very extensively decorated. And so these are the kinds of places that the rich folk live in. A.C. Handley, George Ennis, who ran a clothing store, and the Marx brothers in 702, which was the most elaborate technological wonder of the 19th century, had indoor plumbing, had steam heat, had lights very early on. So in conclusion, I just wanted to suggest that geography and culture go together, and that culture is changed not only and determined not only by geography, but technology also changes the way in which we live and what's possible in this great geographic region that we call Douglas County and this city that we call Lawrence. Okay, thank you very much. That is the introduction to Lawrence's geography and how it relates to culture and how people live both in the hinterland and to a certain extent how they lived in town. I spent a lot of time in the hinterland because Lawrence could not have been possible without that kind of economic and agricultural production that we had in Douglas County. Otherwise, Lawrence would have just been spinning in its own orbit and would have been really kind of a nameless void out there. Okay.